Hi there, Year 11. Welcome to what is our last uh, revision lesson, last lesson altogether. So, if you're listening to this, obviously, I'm assuming you can't make it to the lesson that's being held from 3 o'clock on tomorrow, Tuesday afternoon. So, I'm going to divide it into two parts. We're going to look at Paper 2A, Power of the People, in the first half. There will be opportunities to pause, to go away, have a think about practicing some questions. And obviously, part two, we're going to look at Elizabethan England. So let's jump straight into it. So you all should have a copy of the resource that I'm using on this PowerPoint, on this video. So we should all be aware of what content has been covered in previous years. And as I've said before, just because the Peasants' Revolt come up in the similarity question a couple of years ago, doesn't mean to say it might not come up in another form, in a question 1 or a question 2. So just because you've seen content come up, in previous years in a certain question, that doesn't mean to say it won't come up again in another question. Now, obviously, the big question, question 4, 16 marks, plus, of course, 4 marks for SPAG. That's your evaluation question, where you'll need your breadth of knowledge to demonstrate an understanding of what has been the most important factors driving protests and rebellions across the full breadth of the period. So let's just remind ourselves then, our factors are war, religion, chance, possibly chance. Don't agree with that factor in terms of power of the people, but it's there. We have to be prepared for it. Government, communication, economy, ideas, and role of the individual. And I've put chance in there again, haven't I? So hopefully we're all familiar now with what the major factors driving protest and rebellion have been. As I say, hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at this resource in preparation for your exams. There's an awful lot on it. Now, what I'm going to do with regards to content, I'm going to skip through medieval rebellions and early modern rebellions. There are 2 videos on our YouTube channel already on those subjects, and I hope that you've had a look at them. If you haven't, obviously you need to go back into our YouTube channel and find them. So let's skip straight into possible exam questions. Now, King John, Magna Carta, it has come up as a significance question in the specimen paper. Hasn't been formally examined, so that's one to have a think about. Simon de Montfort has. So with regards to with regards to the medieval rebellions, there hasn't yet been a question on the significance of the Peasants' Revolt. So that is one that you could have a go at planning. So just to remind you how we measure significance, you need to demonstrate an understanding of how the event was important at the time. So looking at the initial impact, in this case, of the Peasants' Revolt, and then demonstrate an understanding of how the significance of the event has changed over time. So we know with the Peasants' Revolt, although it was highly significant with regards to, around 100,000 peasants had descended on London. They burned down John of Gaunt. He was the advisor to King John. They burnt down his palace. They murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury. But we know that Wat Tyler, the leader, was killed, and King Richard promised to meet all of the peasants' demands, but then went back on his promises, and the leaders were rounded up. So it was a total failure, but it was still significant because of what had transpired in London. But then we see in a medium term many of the peasants' demands being fulfilled, such as an abolition of the feudal system, so that villeins were now free men. No more poll taxes were levied. Many of the ideas proposed by John Ball were later picked up in the early modern period by groups like the Levellers. And as we go into the longer term, many historians have argued that this was a highly significant event because it was the first kind of grassroots organized working class revolt against authority. So particularly left-wing historians, socialist historians, see it as the beginnings of a first kind of working class movement. So just to reiterate, the significance question, 2p paragraphs, to demonstrate an understanding of how the significance of this event has changed over time. So look at its immediate and short-term impact, its medium-term impact, how it was important in the longer term, why it's still important today, what historians say about the importance of that event. So if you want to have a go at putting a quick plan together for that question, you can hit the pause button now. So moving on, again, early modern rebellions, there's a whole video on that I posted it a couple of months ago. So if for whatever reason you haven't watched that video yet, that's predominantly content driven, I would advise you to go and have a look at that when you finish this video. So with regards to possible exam questions, we're going to have a look at a source question now. So as you're aware at this stage, question 1, empowering the people, is going to ask you how useful a single source is. So you've done your utility question for paper 1B, confident intention. This is the same type of question, albeit you're only looking at one source, and 99% of the time, the source they give you is a visual source. So just to remind yourselves how you approach that question, you'll need to focus on the content. So what is the source saying? What message is being conveyed? You'll need to evaluate the provenance. What can we learn from the provenance about why the source was produced, when it was produced, the context and time in which it was produced. And of course, then you apply your contextual knowledge. How does the source or the claims being made in the source relate to your knowledge and understanding of the period? So utility really means, what can we use the source for? Okay, how can historians use this particular piece of historical evidence? So you have a source here on the Pilgrimage of Grace. And the question is very straightforward. How useful is source A to a historian studying Henry VIII and the causes of the Pilgrimage of Grace? So that question is quite specific. It's asking you how useful it is if you were a historian trying to look at to disentangle the causes of the Pilgrimage of Grace. Now, the provenance tells us it's a woodcut illustration, and that was a common sort of form of visual communication at the time, by John Fox, showing Henry VIII on the throne, as you can see there, with the Pope being used as his footstool. So he's got his foot on the Pope. Henry has a Bible in his lap and a sword in his hand. And of course, John Fox was a Catholic. So really, what we can infer with regards to the content is Henry VIII is trampling all over the Catholic Church and making a mockery of the Pope. And as we know, by and large, the Pilgrimage of Grace, and the clue, of course, is in the title, a pilgrimage is a religious journey. We know that the Pilgrimage of Grace was a rebellion that was, by and large, provoked by Henry's dissolution of the monasteries, the Act of Supremacy that he passed, which brought the church under his control. And of course, with his advisor Thomas Cromwell, Henry began to ascertain how much wealth the monasteries possessed, and probably went about confiscating church land and dissolving the monasteries. So what we can learn from this source about the causes of the pilgrimage of grace, is clearly useful. It serves a purpose because it's showing us that, by and large, this was a rebellion that was driven by Henry's religious policies. Okay, is it likely the peasants' revolt is going to come up again in a similarity question? The odds are slim because it's come up in a comparison question before, but we can't rule anything out. And I like that question. Compare the peasants' revolt of 1381 to the Pilgrimage of Grace, and in what ways were they similar? Now, how do we approach this question? Well, we focus on there's three things. You look at the causes of each rebellion. What similarities can you find in the causes? Well, we know the Pilgrimage of Grace, as well as being religiously motivated, was also motivated by the economy, by the inflation, by rising taxes, and of course, much of the confiscation of the church wealth was to get Henry VIII out of debt and to make him one of the wealthiest kings in Europe. The Peasants' Revolt, again, was all about the economic grievances of the peasants, the poll tax, the statute of labourers. So there's clearly a similarity in that they were prompted by economic issues. The next stage in this type of question is to look at how the events then developed. Were there any similarities? Well, yes, there are. The Peasants' Revolt was a major uprising that threatened and did become violent. And the Pilgrimage of Grace was a full-scale revolt against Henry's government, and in the Yorkshire Rebellion, at one point it threatened to overwhelm the king's forces. So there's a clear similarity there. And the next thing you think about in this question is outcomes and consequences. Are there any similarities there? And this is where they're very similar, isn't it? Because the peasants were lured into a false sense of confidence in terms of Richard agreeing to meet their demands, and then they rode home only to be, arrested and executed at a later point. Pilgrimage of Grace, John Aske and the other rebels were lured into a false sense of confidence by Henry VIII's promises to meet the demands of the rebels, only then, of course, later to round up the ringleaders. Robert Aske and the others were hanged in chains. So there's clear similarities as well in terms of the outcomes, and both rebellions failed in the short term. As I said before, the exam board have intimated that question 3, as the specification gets older, might well ask you about differences, and if the question is phrased as differences rather than similarities, then the approach is exactly the same. You look at this time the causes, how they were different. You look at the developments of the rebellion, how they were different, and the outcomes of the rebellion, how they were different. So if they do ask for differences rather than similarities, you approach the question in exactly the same way. Okay, so I think that would be a lovely question if it were to come up, but I don't think it will. Now, with regards to another similarity question, this is a potential one. Compare the English Revolution, 1642 to 1649, to the Barons' Rebellion against King John in 1215, 1216. In what ways were they similar? So again, as we've just discussed, you'll need to think about the causes of the rebellions, how they developed, and of course with the outcomes as well. So hit that pause button and give yourself a couple of minutes to think about what similarities can you find in the two rebellions with regards to why they broke out. What similarities can you identify in terms of how the rebellions developed, and what similarities can you identify in terms of the outcomes of those rebellions? Put a quick plan together and then we'll compare notes. So hit the pause button now. Okay, well, clearly in terms of factors, we know that the English Revolution, that inspired Parliament to take on um, the tyranny of Charles I, was prompted by economic grievances, the ship tax that was imposed on the um, whole population, Charles's obsession with personal rule and his divine right. Charles was accused of being a tyrant. There was also religious factors involved. Um, Charles was suspected of being a Catholic. Now, with regards to the events of 1215, we know that taxes were a big gripe that the barons had towards King John. We know there were issues with government. John refused to share power. He trusted a select group of foreign advisors. He was also accused of being a tyrant. We know that there was religious factors involved when John was excommunicated. Now, with regards to how the events developed, clearly both rebellions led to civil war. In the case of the English Civil War of 1642, it was a very long, drawn-out civil war, which resulted in the execution of Charles I. Now, with regards to King John, the civil war ended, of course, with the death of King John. He drank too much beer, and there was rumor that he might have been poisoned. Now, with outcomes, of course, the Magna Carta was imposed in the wake um, of King John's death. That subsequent monarchs had to be bound by it. It was a big limitation on kingship, and obviously with the English Revolution, the monarchy was abolished altogether. Um, Ushering in the period of the interregnum. So a little bit of a difference there, but nevertheless, I think there's some quite clear similarities. Another question you might want to put a quick plan together for is compare the American Revolution of 1776 to the English Revolution of 1649. And again, what ways were they similar? You might even want to think about differences. Clearly, if we're talking about similarities, um, government, obviously the colonists in America were tired of being ruled from Westminster without any say, just as the Parliament was tired of Charles's personal rule. Taxes, of course, were a big cause of the American Revolution. No taxation without representation. Ideas, yeah, were all a factor, just as they were in the English Revolution. And when you look at the English Revolution and many of the groups that emerged during that time, the levelers and the diggers, who had ideas about common land ownership and people working together in communes. We see radical new ideas which were are very much early versions of socialism, whereas the American Revolution, occurring as it did at sort of the height of the Enlightenment, was really a rejection of this idea of monarchical rule and rule, one, well, certainly rule from Westminster. And the framers of the American Constitution were very influenced by people like Thomas Paine, and and these ideas of this rejection of the old way of doing things, if you will, and the idea that man is can work. Man is a rational creature. Man can use reason. He doesn't need to be governed by kings using underpinned by superstitious religious belief. So there was a whole host of ideas that were bubbling away under both revolutions. Obviously, in terms of outcomes, we know that the Americans were successful at the Battle of Yorktown, and the English were defeated. And likewise, Charles I, as we know, was overthrown. So just as King George III was overthrown in America, Charles I was overthrown by Parliament. So lots of similarities and outcomes as well. Now, with regards to 19th century protests, obviously a key theme is the growth of the political rights of the labouring classes or the working classes that was seen most powerfully through the Chartist movement. So that would be if it came up, that would be a lovely question, a significant question on Chartism. We know that the 6 points of the People's Charter, if I just go back a slide here, was, of course, the People's Charter, so called because this was a People's Charter, as opposed to a Great Charter or Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, 63 clauses. This, of course, just had 6. So the Chartists were petitioning for the vote for every man over the age of 21, a secret ballot, which means that people would be able to vote secretly, no property qualification for MPs. In other words, only very wealthy people own property. And of course, because no one was paid to be an MP, that meant that only very wealthy people could sit in parliaments. So that had to change as well. Equal constituencies, meaning that constituencies were fair rather than some constituencies being massively overrepresented, while some areas like Manchester and Liverpool didn't have any representation in Parliament at all. Annual parliaments, which means there should be an election every year. So those were the 6 points of the People's Charter. We know the Chartists were divided in their aims. There was the moral force Chartism, led by people like William Lovett, who wanted to achieve reform peacefully. Then there was the physical force Chartists, led by Fergus O'Connor, who believed that violence might be necessary to achieve their aims. They put 3 petitions to Parliament, all of which were rejected. So in the short term, Chartism was very significant. They had a newspaper. There were times when violence broke out, as in Newport in 1838. The plug riots, when the second petition was rejected in 1842. They went, pulling the plugs out of the steam engines in the factories as an act of sort of industrial sabotage. So, but nevertheless, they failed in their aims in the short term. However, just like in the Peasants' Revolt, pretty much all of the aims of the Chartists were fulfilled in the decades that came. So skilled working men were given the vote in 1867. Secret ballot was introduced in 1872. Men in the counties, the countryside, were given the vote on the same terms as men in the towns in 1884. All working men were then given the vote at the end of the First World War, and some women. All women were given the vote in 1928, and MPs were finally paid in 1911. So we can see pretty much all of the Chartist aims were fulfilled in the longer term. So that's really what you'd have to demonstrate an understanding of in that type of question. And of course, how historians see Chartism as a very significant the first proper working class movement. And many historians would argue that in the Chartist movement lay the origins of our Labour Party. So that would be a lovely question if it came up. Continuing with the theme of the 19th century, of course, there's the Anti-Corn Law League that petitioned for the end of the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws, of course, were a tax on foreign grain that, of course, made the price of bread artificially high for the working classes. It was an organisation that was put together by radical MPs and, of course, by factory owners who wanted the Corn Laws scrapped so they could pay lower wages to the workforce. Unlike Chartism, it didn't use violence. As we know, led by radical MPs like John Bright, and they used peaceful protests. They developed memorabilia, and they were very successful because the Corn Laws were abolished in 1846. So you might want to have a go at this utility question here. So it's from Punch magazine, which is a very famous historical magazine that often, used images and artists' drawings to satirize current events. So this is showing Robert Peel depicted as a small child. Peel, of course, was the Prime Minister, Conservative Prime Minister at the time. He's being taken for a walk by Richard Cobden, who is one of the leaders of the Anti-Corn Law League. The cartoon is entitled Papa Cobden taking Master Robert for a free trade walk. So it's useful in terms of looking at revealing what the current attitudes to the whole debate over free trade were at the time. So this was kind of like the very much like the Brexit of its time. Should England abolish all its tariffs? A tariff, of course, is a tax on goods coming into the country. Should it abolish all its tariffs and convert to a system of free trade? And what the source is revealing, of course, is that the journalists and satirists at Punch magazine very clearly believed that Peel was really, I guess, a little bit sort of slow to understand the importance of abolishing this tariff, and he's kind of being led to that realization by the Anti-Corn Law League, and that's certainly what I infer from it. Anti-slavery movement, very under-assessed to date, and given how topical race relations in this country have been in recent years with Black Lives Matter and various other groups, I've got a feeling it could come up in some form. Okay, so I'm assuming that you've had a look at this and revised this topic. So explain the significance of the anti-slavery movement, or even compare the Anti-Corn Law League to the anti-slavery movement. In what ways were they similar? So when you're looking at the anti-slavery movement and measuring its significance, it was really, really important. William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson were founding members of the Anti-Slavery Society. They campaigned tirelessly for slavery to be abolished in Britain. They held public meetings, they produced posters, they produced pamphlets. Clarkson even went aboard the slave ships that were used to take slaves across the Atlantic, and he collected information and documentation. And he was meticulous at trying to demonstrate how appalling the conditions were aboard the ships. Many working class people in England supported the movement, and there was even a petition signed in Manchester. So it was highly significant, and it was successful. Slavery was abolished in Britain in 1807, and it was abolished in the wider British Empire in 1833. Many women got involved in the abolition movement, even women who, at this point, of course, were not allowed to vote. Some historians, would be a little bit more skeptical as to how much of an impact it really had. They would look at, in terms of the British Empire, for example, the Abolition of Slavery Act of 1833 only gave instant freedom to slaves under the age of 6. The rest were put into age categories and were promised freedom after 4 years. So the criticism was that this was not an instant end to the problem, but more of a staggered abolition of slavery. But no, you can't underestimate the long-term impact, of course, because this would inspire other countries to follow the same example. And it was a prime cause of the American Civil War, which was all fought over the issue of slavery. So that's two good questions to have a go at. Now, staying on the theme of 19th century protests, the social reform movement, again, something that has been significantly underassessed. Well, it hasn't been assessed at all. So it's a good one to perhaps pay a little bit more attention to, as you in the 24 hours before the exam. So the question here I've sort of anticipated is, how significant was the work of social reformers in improving working and living conditions for the labouring classes. So the big social reformer. Now, social reform, this is someone, often a philanthropist, someone who's made a lot of money from a particular enterprise, but who puts that money to good use. So Lord, I would. There were many, social reformers like Edward Chadwick in public health. I would stick with someone like Lord Shaftesbury because he did so much to improve the lives of the labouring classes. He set up lunacy laws that improved the way mentally ill people were treated. He pushed for a 10 hours bill, limited the numbers of hours per day and days per week children could work. He set up a Children's Employment Commission, which resulted in the Mines and Collieries Act, which prohibited the employment of women and children underground in the mines. He was a strong supporter of prohibiting boys being employed as chimney sweeps. He started up the ragged schools, which were effectively schools for poor children that were run by volunteers. So he did an awful lot of work to improve the living and the working conditions of the most vulnerable in society. Now, you could argue in terms of the big areas of social reform like unemployment insurance, health insurance, pensions. They weren't even thought about at the time, and they weren't rolled out until the early 20th century. But nevertheless, I think his reforms, were highly significant in improving the lives of the ordinary people. Okay, there's another similarity question there. Compare the work of social reformers in the 19th century to the campaign for women's rights after 1945. In what ways were they similar? So not women's political rights, but women's rights after World War II, which we'll come to in a moment. Okay, with regards to workers' rights, so in the 19th century, again, this is a real possibility. Now, the Tolpodal martyrs have come up a couple of times, so I wouldn't expect them to come up. But more broadly, there could well be a question on the significance of the trade unions in general in improving workers' rights in the 19th century. So to do that, you would need to talk about some of the high-profile strikes that took place in the 19th century. So you could look at the Match Girls strike. So broadly, the unions that emerged were often known as the new unions. So they were unions that had a very cheap subscription rate, so that ordinary workers could afford to join them. So they campaigned to improve the rights for ordinary workers. They encouraged workers to go out on strike as a form of collective bargaining. And in many instances, they were successful. So the Match Girls strike, the Match Girls are some of the most poorly paid, and it was some of the most dangerous work. The phosphorus of the matches resulted in a deformation of the jaw that became known as phossy jaw. Annie Besant was a bit of a champagne socialist who became the sort of the focal point for the Match Girls, and the strike lasted, as it says there, for 5 weeks, and employers gave in to the workers' demands. And it was a kind of a watershed moment in terms of the first time unskilled workers had successfully bargained for an improvement in their working conditions. And that was followed up by various other strikes. The gas workers' strike of 1889, which was also successful to reduce the hours of the working day. The dock workers' strike of 1889, the summer of 1889, the dock work was casual labour. It was poorly paid. It was dangerous. The dockers demanded, first of all, too many dockers were available for what they call on-call or call-on work. So there might not be any work, but there might be So basically, the dockers demanded what became known as the dockers' tanner, and that meant a minimum payment of 6d per hour, so the old currency, and a minimum employment per day of 4 hours. They brought the whole of the docklands in London to a standstill over the summer. They received significant support from trade unions overseas who kept the strikers going. And the dockers, in the end, again, it was a successful strike, and the dockers got their tanner, they got their minimum payment, and they got their guaranteed 4-hour day. Okay, so you can also have a think about the comparison question. Compare the work of the trade unions in the 19th century to the campaign for the People's Charters. The Charters, in what ways were they different? So you might want to pause this video and just have a think about putting a quick plan together for that question. So with regards to 20th century protests, obviously the female suffrage movement is highly significant. We know that the suffragettes were eventually successful in gaining the vote. So as a result of the suffragettes' militancy, and arguably even perhaps what women demonstrated they were capable of doing in the First World War, some women were given a vote in 1918. All women were given a vote in 1928. But that's really important to remember. That wasn't the end of the struggle for women in England. So particularly the Second World War, women again went into the factories, and even at the end of the Second World War, there was still the expectation that women would return back to being, responsible for running the home, for looking after the husband, for looking after the children. And so women then, the focus of the female campaign was really geared towards winning the same kind of rights in the workplace as men. So so a good protest to look at is the Ford's Dagenham motor factory. So women's work was effectively reclassified. It was considered to be unskilled work, and they were paid 25% less than men to do the same work. They went on strike. Barbara Castle, of course, a very prominent female politician, intervened to negotiate a higher wage for women, and a settlement was eventually reached. Now, this led to the government passing an Equal Pay Act in 1970, which came into force in 1975. And this piece of legislation made it illegal for employers to discriminate against women who were doing the same job as men. Other advances for women's rights, of course, was in 1923, a Matrimonial Causes Act granted equal rights to a divorce, so women were becoming more powerful within the institution of marriage. An Abortion Act, 1967, legalized abortion. 1969, the Divorce Act allowed a marriage to end if it was considered to be irreparably broken. 1974, the birth control pill became available on the National Health Service. And 1975, as we've just seen, the Employment Protection Act made it illegal to fire a woman if she was pregnant. And the Sex Discrimination Act also came into effect. So the thing to remember about women's rights, the struggle did not end in 1928 when women were granted the vote on the same terms as men. The struggle then became, more about women's rights in the institution of marriage, women's rights with regards to contraception and abortion, and of course women's, the women's rights to equal pay in the workplace. Now, with regards to workers' rights in the 20th century, is the general strike of 1926. So this is when the whole country. It started off as obviously with the miners disputing the increase of their hours and the reduction of their wages after the First World War, and all the other unions came out on a sympathy strike. The government at the time saw this as potential revolution. The general strike of 1926 wasn't successful. The government was able to draft in the army, um, and the Trade Disputes Act effectively made it illegal to go on a sympathy strike thereafter. Now, also be prepared to talk about, the how after even though the unions kind of were, a lot of their power was stripped away in 1926, 1927, after World War II with the Labour government, the trade unions became very, very powerful. So much so that they were able to bring down the Conservative government of Ted Heath. Again, he was brought down by the miners in 1974. And so Margaret Thatcher, when she came to power in 1979, one of her objectives was to curtail union power altogether. So there was a very famous strike, the miners' strike of 1984, which was led by the National Union of Miners, led by Arthur Scargill, and that was eventually, it was called because of, the Thatcher government was effectively closing down all the pits in the country. The strike was not successful, and mining was pretty much shut down. And with it, excuse me, up until recent times, when unions have become more militant again, trade union power appeared to be crushed. And the last thing to really focus on, of course, is minority rights, how Britain's become a multiracial society since the Second World War. Again, this is something it's been very topical. I've got a feeling it could well come up. So, really, what was the cause of mass migration to Britain? Well, Britain, of course, had a vast empire which was beginning to be wound up after the Second World War, or wound down, I should say. So many subjects of the British Empire from India, and then India was given independence, and of course was the partition created Pakistan, and of course parts of the Caribbean, parts of Britain's former colonies in Africa, and obviously there was a big demand for work after the Second World War and a depleted population. So mass migration took place. These former subjects of the British Empire came to England to do the work that needed to be done. So obviously this had a big impact on the UK. There was a lot of fear and suspicion. In 1958 there was a race riot in Notting Hill. And it led to it led to perhaps a political backlash from some those on the right in politics. So the Conservative MP Enoch Powell gave a very notorious speech in 1968, which went on to be called the Rivers of Blood speech, in which Powell talked about the dangers of uncontrolled immigration, and his views were shared by many people. And so the government was increasingly pressured into introducing legislation to try to stem the flow of immigration. Okay, so in 1962 they passed a Commonwealth Immigrants Act. However, other legislation which went some way to improving the rights of minorities included the 1965 Race Relations Act, which outlawed discrimination on the grounds of colour, race, or ethnic or national origins. So there is a broad one of the things to be prepared for is to be able to give some examples of how the rights of minorities have improved, particularly since the 1960s. So you could point to the Race Relations Act of 1968, the 1971, I tried to stem immigration. Sorry, the 1976 Council for Racial Equality, the 2000 Race Relations Act. All of these measures went some way to improving the rights of minorities in Britain. And then, of course, something we've talked about extensively in the past, the Brixton riots, the race riots of 1981, which was really sparked by the government's sus laws. Brixton riots came up last year as the question 2, the significance, but it could well come up again as a question 3 or even as a question 1. And of course, you can talk about it in the factors question. So have a go. Okay, have a go at this question 2. Explain the significance of migration to Britain after the Second World War in terms of why there was the need for people to come to Britain to work, the impact that had, the tensions it caused, and of course how the government passed legislation that gave immigrants better rights in Britain. You could also compare the Brixton riots of 1981 to the Peasants' Revolt. In what ways were they similar? So you might want to pause the video, take a minute or two to have a think about those questions and put some ideas down. Okay, to the factors question. As I discussed in the Easter revision lesson, there are, as I see it, 3 possible variations of this question. You might be asked about what factor has been the most important causes of protests since medieval times. That was the approach last year, so be prepared for a slightly different approach. Another approach could be, what was the most important factor in the improvement of people's rights? What was the most important factor, or what was the main method used by protesters to campaign for their rights? So, was, for example, communication the most important factor in the improvement of people's rights? Was ideas the main method used by protesters to campaign for their rights? So there are 3 different variations. So don't expect it just to be on what was the most important cause of protests. Could we see other variations? The example I can think of here, has violence been the main method used by governments since medieval times to suppress or crush protest movements? You've got to understand this specification is 5 years old now. So they are going to vary these questions up. We can't just expect it to be about, causes. So they could well ask, in terms of how governments have responded. I can't see that's that likely, but let's just, have that in the back of our minds just to be prepared. So hopefully you've had some time to have a look at some of the questions I've put together on this presentation and to have a go at planning some of them. So this is a possible question for, have governments been the main cause of protests since medieval times? Again, this is a causation question. Who knows? But hopefully, just for general revision, it's a good one to plan. So I hope you've had a go at doing that. Another possible question for, have ideas been the main factor in promoting people's rights in Britain since medieval times? Now that is a good one to have a go at. Certainly, I think, if with regards to the Middle Ages, we see with Simon de Montfort the idea of calling the commoners to Parliament, which became the basis of our House of Commons. The ideas of John Bull that inspired the Peasants' Revolt. The ideas that emerged in the English Revolution, particularly the more radical groups like the Levellers and the Diggers, talked about, common, effectively collective farming and land redistribution, which we would recognise as kind of modern socialist ideas. Then, of course, it was, the American Revolution, no taxation without representation. The 19th century protests quite clearly the six aims of the People's Charter, the ideas of full male suffrage, and then of course into the 20th century, the ideas of women's political rights and women's rights in the workplace, and of course the rights of minorities. So there's a lot you could get out there of the stated factor, as we know for this type of question. Okay, just remember, your answer must include examples of protests and rebellions throughout the whole range of the period. One factor per paragraph. If you can, start with the stated factor. In each paragraph, provide at least 3 examples of how each factor is important across the full range. So, one example of how the Middle Age, one example from the medieval period, one example from the early modern period, and one example from either the 19th century or the 20th century. Minimum of 2 factors plus a judgment conclusion paragraph. You got 20 minutes, and don't forget the importance of accurate spelling, punctuation, and grammar. 4 extra marks just through writing well. Okay, so full range of the period. Don't just focus your answer on the early modern period or the Middle Ages. Make sure each paragraph, for each factor, you're demonstrating at least one example of how that factor was important in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period, and even the 19th or the 20th century. Go to your second paragraph, another factor. Use that same technique. Now, good judgments, of course, will often point to the fact that some factors are clearly more important over time than others. As we've long discussed, war might have been, well, I guess war was still quite important even into the 20th century with the 2 world wars, but clearly in terms of as a method, for example, used to gain greater rights. I mean, war starts to kind of retreat as a factor as we go into the 19th century, 20th century. Religion, massively important in the Middle Ages, early modern, but then kind of loses its importance altogether. Other factors, though, are important across the whole range of the period, aren't they? Government, economy. So the good conclusions will understand that some factors have been more important over time, over this 800 years, than other factors. Okay, so that is the conclusion of part 1. Give yourself a 5-minute break and we'll have a quick flick through Elizabethan England. Okay, so part 2, paper 2B, Elizabethan England. Now, I'm hoping, because this is obviously the last part of the content that we covered only very recently, I'm hoping that this is still fresh in your minds. You still have the textbooks. So let's just let's just fly through this just to remind ourselves of where we need to be focusing our revision. So, as you know, part 1 focuses on Elizabeth's court and her relations with Parliament. Okay, so we know obviously the Queen's court, it went everywhere with her. So the court comprised of politicians, personal advisors, the gentry, the nobility, her astrologers, even down to the people that handmaidens who looked after her, did her makeup. And as we know, on Elizabeth, when she went on her progresses, her entire court would come with her. So the patronage system, of course, was very clever. Elizabeth was able to give out titles and positions to members of particularly of the nobility, and she was able to use that to sort of play ambitious politicians off against each other. So she used the patronage system to great effect. So patronage, you're giving out titles and power. We know she relied, particularly in her younger years, she relied very heavily on her Privy Council. Yeah, I mean these guys were her sounding boards. They were her advisors. They were some of her most trusted lieutenants. So if you can, try to make sure that you remember who some of the more prominent members of the Privy Council were. So William Cecil. This is where things get confusing. His name, of course, William Cecil, but he went by the title of Lord Burleigh. All right, he was the longest, well, one of the longest serving, her most trusted lieutenant. And although she managed to fall out with him towards the end of his life, there was Walsingham, of course, who was head of the Secret Service, what we would call MI5 and MI6 today, who, of course, intercepted all the plots against her. There was Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, and, of course, there was Devereux, the Earl of Essex, who was executed when he rebelled against Elizabeth in 1601. We've seen in our lessons that the role of Parliament under Elizabeth was really, Elizabeth resented Parliament, and she only called Parliament, if you remember, really predominantly for for the raising of taxes. If you remember, she saw Parliament MPs little more than unruly little boys. So very much the Queen dominated Parliament, and she even at times stopped MPs from debating issues in Parliament that was sensitive to her. Now, one of those issues, of course, was the issue of succession. We know that Elizabeth never married. She had potential suitors galore, but she never married. She never produced an heir to the throne. So there was a massive issue over who was going to succeed Elizabeth when she died. And of course, as we know, that's why Mary, Queen of Scots, became such a threat to Elizabeth, because she was a legitimate rival to the throne. As we know, by the late 1590s, beginning of the 1600s, Elizabeth was old. She'd ruled for too long. Her authority was breaking down. Her control of the Privy Council and her court was breaking down, and that resulted in the rebellion of the Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux, in 1601. And of course, that rebellion is significant because it shows that Elizabeth's grip on power was beginning to break down towards the end of her life. So here's some questions to think about. We know, so question, have I gone too far? Yes. We know that question 1 is an interpretation question. Okay, so you're going to get an interpretation from a historian, whether it's in the history review or a historical book, and they are going to give you an interpretation written by an historian, and they're going to ask you how convincing the interpretation is. Now, so what you've got to do, as we've discussed for this question, 2 things: analysis and evaluation. First thing, you need to break down, what is the historian saying? What is the argument that this historian is making? What are the main points the historian puts forward? And second of all, the evaluation. How convincing are the arguments? How convincing do you find them, based on your understanding of of Elizabethan England? So this interpretation is all about the succession question. So I hope you can't hear my DIY neighbour drilling away at. I'm recording this at 7:10 at night. Probably will come through a little bit, but it's putting me off. Anyway, so have a go. Pause the video. Have a go at this question. Okay. Two things. Break down the extract. What is the main point the historian is making? Then, once you've identified the point the historian is making, the argument that he's making, evaluate it. How convincing do you find these points based on your understanding of Elizabethan England? So, hit the pause button now. Go away, spend 10 minutes planning, just thinking about that question. Now, with regards to potential question 2. Question 2 is going to ask you to explain what was important about, okay, and whatever comes up in the exam. So predominantly this is a question that really gets you thinking about consequences. And that's very much what, that's, when you look at the mark schemes, that is what they're asking you to look at. So, explain what was important about the Privy Council in Elizabethan England. What function did it serve? How did it, strengthen Elizabeth's position? Explain what was important about progresses in Elizabethan England. Again, how did Elizabeth use progresses? How did it strengthen her position? Explain what was important about the marriage question for Elizabeth's succession. How did this become, in other words, a thorny issue? How did this kind of undermine her authority? Potential question 3 on part 1, write an account of how the succession question affected Elizabethan England. Now, you've seen this question before, you've done it in paper 1B. So, write an account, not just a narrative. You need to think about, building up a sequence of events, looking at the causes, key events, and consequences. Okay, so moving on, part 2. So, part 2 is very much focused on life in Elizabethan times. Okay, so of course Elizabeth's rule coincided with the English Renaissance. This rebirth of ideas. There was the rise of the gentry. There was the emergence of the printing press that meant ideas could get around far more quickly. And there was still this notion, this Elizabethan notion of the great chain of being. So just going to go through this. So obviously fashion, you need to be aware of fashion. We know that Elizabeth was very much a trend setter. She was imitated and copied. We know that it was also a time of what was known as the Great Rebuilding. Many new architectural projects got underway. So Hardwicke Hall, for example, was a great, Bess of Hardwicke, of course, who was married to the Earl of, George Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, and that building reflected the great chain of being. So the top gallery was always reserved for the Queen if she was to rock up on one of her progresses. So there was a great sort of rebuilding. There's big innovations in architecture. Another trend, of course, was the growing prosperity and the rise of the gentry. So the gentry were kind of what we call lesser landowners, and they were becoming increasingly wealthy. Nobility, of course, are people who have got titles and positions of authority, but the gentry were beginning to become more and more influential in Elizabethan society. And they were hungry for art and literature. And so they were very wealthy, so that kind of kick-started a cultural revival in England. We know a big part of Elizabethan life was the theatre. We've discussed oftentimes how theatre was outlawed. Actors were seen as no better than thieves or drunks or beggars. But theatre became increasingly endorsed by the nobility. purpose-built theatres were built like the Globe in London. Very influential plays were put on. We have the big Elizabethan playwrights of Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare, and we know ultimately Elizabeth came to see theatre as a brilliant propaganda opportunity. Okay, it was also great entertainment. It was a way of distracting the poorer elements in society from their pitiful lives. But more importantly, she recognised that a powerful pro-government message could be cultivated through theatre. So it became a very important propaganda tool to promote Elizabeth's government. When we're looking at life in Elizabethan times, we need to be able to focus on poverty. Massive, massive issue. You will need to be able to identify the causes of poverty. So there was the inflation that got going under Henry VIII. There were attempts to curtail the wages earned by the labouring classes. The long-term impact of the dissolution of the monasteries meant that there was no one to care or house the poor. We know that the Elizabethan government had a very dim view of begging. Various different pieces of government legislation were passed to try to tackle the problems of where have we gone with that? Of the problem of poverty, and all of that was put together in an Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601. So you'll need to be able to explain the Poor Law, what it entailed, but ultimately it was, it created really a two-tier kind of treatment of poor people. One, of course, being the deserving poor, the infirm, the people that wanted to work but couldn't because of sickness, old age, disability, and the undeserving poor, who of course were the vagabonds, the sturdy beggars, the con men, people who could work but didn't want to, and they were treated very harshly. Another key feature of life in Elizabethan England was, of course, exploration. So again, go back and what were the main causes for this great exploration of the globe. You'll need to talk about John Hawkins, Sir Francis Drake, the pioneers, the people that navigated parts of the world that had never been seen before. Their ideas in terms of ship design. So we know that Sir Francis Drake became the first English sailor to circumnavigate the globe. In other words, sailing all the way around the world. We know he was a pirateer. We know he was called El Draco by the Spanish because of his propensity to raid Spanish ships of all their gold and silver and then sink them. Sir Walter Raleigh, of course, who, again, another great pioneer of exploration, who received, again, a royal patent from Elizabeth to establish colonies in America. So this is the beginnings of the English colonizations of the American continent. So, have a go at this question. There's an interpretation there on the motives behind Elizabethan exploration. So you might want to have a go at planning this. Hit the pause button if you want to have a go at planning this. Remember, analysis, break down the argument that is being made, evaluate, highlight at least, try to pinpoint at least two aspects of the argument, or at least two key features of what the historian is saying. How convincing do you find it based on your contextual understanding? There's also opportunities to have a go at some potential question 2s and some potential question freeze. So again, hit the pause button. Just spend 10 minutes if you've got it, scribbling some ideas down. How would you approach these questions? There might well be one of these questions might well be in the exam. Just don't know. Now, part 3, troubles at home and abroad. Of course, this relates to obviously the big religious issues that Elizabeth faced. So we know that her father, Henry VIII, was a Catholic. Her half-brother, Edward, was a Protestant. Her half-sister, Mary, was an extreme Catholic. Elizabeth had been educated and raised as a Protestant, but we know she tried to find a settlement. She tried to find a middle way. But of course, as we know, it was very difficult to find a middle way between the two extremes. And Elizabeth passed another Act of Supremacy, which gave her control of the English Church. She passed various different pieces of legislation. The Act of Supremacy, again, all members of the Church of England had to swear an oath of allegiance to her. An Act of Uniformity, this is the important one, of 1559. So everyone's got to behave in a uniform way. So it governed the way churches looked and how services were held. Attendance was compulsory and skipping church was punishable with a fine. Books and prayers were now back in English rather than Latin. Catholic practices like pilgrimages and saints' images were banned. So she tries to find a middle way, but of course it pleases neither side. The Protestants, and more particularly the Puritans, are unhappy, and the Catholics roundly reject Elizabeth's religious policies. The recusants, these were people, if you remember, that refused to attend church services. Priests continue to conduct Catholic-style services in secret. Priest holes were built, so priests who were being hunted and persecuted could escape. Now, matters came to a head with the Northern Rebellion of 1569. This is a very, very significant Catholic uprising against Elizabeth. Like many rebellions, it was predicated on support from Spain, and when that support failed to materialize, the rebellion collapsed. Obviously, Mary, Queen of Scots, is in the background now at this time. There were various different Catholic plots against Elizabeth. Of course, there was after the Northern Uprising of 1569 and 1570, Elizabeth is excommunicated. She's expelled from the Catholic Church, and we begin to see a range of Catholic plots: the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, and of course the Babington plot. The Throckmorton plot, of course, as we know, was discovered when Mary, Queen of Scots, was under house arrest at Sheffield Manor Lodge. And the Babington plot, of course, is what does for Mary, Queen of Scots, in that Francis Walsingham was able to demonstrate that she was part of the plot. So we've done a lot of Mary, Queen of Scots. The Armada that we covered only several weeks ago, but obviously there was a long-standing tension between England and Spain. England, of course, was supporting the resistance in the Netherlands, which at the time was a Spanish colony. We know that the English were sinking Spanish ships coming back from America. And of course, then there was the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, which prompted King Philip of Spain to launch an armada, an attempted invasion of England, we know there was a combination of, the English ships were better designed, but then there was the element of the weather. All of these were important factors in the English victory. Then, of course, there was a role of Sir Francis Drake sending the fire ships, which sent the Spanish fleet, scattered the Spanish fleet as they were attempting to dock in France at Calais to pick up more troops. And along with the weather, that forced the Spanish fleet up the English Channel to the North Sea and around Scotland, where many of the boats were shipwrecked. It was a great propaganda victory for Elizabeth, and there were a variety of factors of why the Spanish lost: poor leadership, poor planning, the superiority of England's weapons, the superiority of the English galleons, and of course the good old English weather. So you might remember we had a go at this interpretation about Catholic resistance to Elizabeth's religious policies in the lesson. So there's just a reminder there as to how you approach this question. Break down the main points a historian makes, then evaluate them to develop an overall appreciation of how convincing the interpretation is. Here are some here's some potential questions on troubles at home and abroad. Again, pick a couple and have a go at them. Now, of course, Sheffield Manor Lodge is our study of the historic environment. We know this is our question 4. We've had a go at writing a mock question 4. And without any further ado, hopefully you've had a time to look through this resource. But this is the question that we had a go at, and you all did really well on, actually, 6 weeks or so ago. Guarding Mary Queen of Scots was a dangerous and expensive task. How far does a study of Sheffield Manor Lodge support this statement? And you should refer to Sheffield Manor Lodge and your contextual knowledge. Given the weighting of the resources on important personalities and events connected with Sheffield Manor Lodge, I 95% anticipate that that's what they're going to ask you. Okay, in some way about George Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, the impact guarding Mary Queen of Scots had on him. I really do think it's going to be on events connected to Sheffield Manor Lodge and the personalities connected to Sheffield Manor Lodge. Otherwise, what was the point of the resource booklet that they put together? Because that was the sole focus of the booklet. So we've had a go at this question. There's just a reminder there of if this does come up in some form, you've got, hopefully you still got your resource packs. I uploaded on Teams yesterday the full plan that goes with this question. So at least we know question 4, our 16-mark question, it is going to be on Sheffield Manor Lodge, and I highly suspect it is going to focus on either events connected to Sheffield Manor Lodge and key personalities. So Mary Queen of Scots and the impact of her being under house arrest at Sheffield Manor Lodge, I'm 95% sure will be the focus of the question, which is of course what we had a go at 6 weeks ago or whenever it was. So this is a reminder of a sample peak paragraph to go with that question. Okay, right, we're at an end. We've raced through Elizabeth, but hopefully, this is still fresh in your mind because it is obviously the most recent piece of content that we've covered. So remember, question 1, your interpretation question. 2 paragraphs, 12 to 15 minutes, 8 marks. Question 2, explain what was important about. 2p paragraphs, 12 minutes, 8 marks. Question 3, write an account. Maximum, again, 12 minutes, 2p paragraphs, 8 marks. And question 4, which we know is going to be in Sheffield Manor Lodge, 2p paragraphs. So, go back into the plan, look at how you would plan it in terms of, one paragraph in support of the conceit in the question, one paragraph challenging the conceit in the question, and then an overall judgment. 20 minutes, 16 marks. I hope this has helped. I know it's been a bit of a whistle tour, but we're almost there, aren't we? So, if I don't see you in the actual revision lesson, all the best of luck. Just go and do your best.